Welcome to Cowboys Deep Cuts. I am Edward Egros. The NFL draft has come and gone, but not without reminding us just how much we crave and miss sports right now. It is the best we can do, but our best is actually pretty good. As for the Cowboys, most everyone I've spoken to loves this class, but why did it pan out the way it did? And just how good was it this year compared with both other years and compared with other teams? Back by popular demand, Benjamin Robinson, data scientist, author of grindingthemocks.com, and chairman of the Joe Burrow fan club, joined now. Benjamin, how are you?
Oh, man, let's keep that on the download. Joe doesn't know that. But thanks for having me on again. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And you know, we'll keep it quiet because, you know, Joe's a very shy, reserved kind of guy. And, you know, we don't want to make him nervous. You know, it's not like he's played on big stages before.
Yeah,
right. So before the draft, one of the things that you and I talked about was how well the Cowboys have done in the last 5 years in terms of draft surplus value. Now, let's first define what draft surplus value is and how Dallas performed for this draft in terms of surplus value.
I define this surplus value in the draft as it's a pure efficiency metric. It's all it does is says, hey, you know, in my bevy of mock draft data that I have, you know, I try to come up with an expected draft position for each player. And I talked about that a little bit, you know, when we spoke last week. And so the goal is that after we have those expected draft positions, we basically rank the players and then look at how they were drafted relative to expectation. So, you know, the Cowboys, like you said, did really well in the draft this year. And so when we look at, you know, the different metrics I have for looking at overall the efficiency of their draft, you know, you can tell how well they did because they were, you know, one of the top one or two teams in terms of average draft surplus value. So that is that per pick metric. And then also on a total basis, they were the number one team in terms of total draft surplus value. And so, you know, it's one thing to say, yeah, I had a feeling that the Cowboys were just drafting players pick after pick at much later draft positions than their expectation. But then it's something else when we can actually quantify it. And so, you know, it was really fun draft if you were a Cowboys fan, because it just seemed that pick after pick after pick, Jerry Jones and the team were just able to get not just good players, but players at valuable positions and at much later selections than we might have thought they would have gone before the draft. And it started with the first pick with CeeDee Lamb. And I know that, you know, when we talked last week, you know, it seemed that a lot of people thought the consensus was that they would take an edge rusher, K'Lavon Chaisson from LSU, who ended up going at pick 20 to the Jaguars. You know, he was still around when the Cowboys were selecting. And so some people were concerned that the Cowboys were going to just stick with the guy that they maybe had thought would be there. And so maybe because of that, you overthink things and you just take the guy who you always wanted to take, regardless of whether a player at a kind of more valuable expected draft position would be there. And so, you know, we talked a little bit last week. We thought maybe Justin Jefferson would be the pick. I don't think any of us had thought that if there was a player that was going to fall, it was going to be CeeDee Lamb. And I think that the CeeDee Lamb, the wide receiver from Oklahoma, who, you know, was pretty much the 1A, 1B type of wide receiver in this draft class for me by my expected draft position, was there. I think that set the tone for the entire draft. And, you know, Jerry Jones was sitting on his, you know, $100 million yacht, working with the team remotely. Yeah, exactly. Working, you know, remotely with the team and put together this type of draft is just, you know, so impressive. And I think that people were really excited about the draft because it showed the Cowboys had a willingness to just take that best player available approach, but really do it seriously and not just take the best player, but take the best player available at really premium positions. You know, we talked about how I thought it would be really great to, you know, help Dak Prescott. CeeDee Lamb is going to help Dak Prescott quite a lot. It's going to be really exciting to have. It's going to be really exciting to have CD and Amari Cooper and Michael Gallup on the field because they're also versatile. You know, Amari Cooper, we think of him as a premier outside receiver. He was also, you know, maybe even more effective in the slot. And it's a similar thing with CeeDee Lamb, where in college he was an effective outside receiver, but also a really effective slot receiver. So, I think Dallas is going to be really dynamic. And when you look at what Mike McCarthy has done in his past with the Packers, they were most successful when they had three dynamic wide receivers and Aaron Rodgers throwing the ball. So, it's really a very exciting time, I think, to be a Cowboys fan. I think that you can't not be excited for the coming season whenever it comes because of the draft that you had and how much you're going to be helping Dak, and then also, helping deal with some holes that we thought were there in the secondary on day two when they drafted Trevon Diggs. So, to me, it's not just the draft when I look at this surplus value and say, hey, they did really well, but also, their top picks were really on premium positions at wide receiver and at cornerback, and they can afford to do those things because they have Dak. And so having Dak has this, you're going to have above average to excellent quarterback play especially from an efficiency standpoint. You're going to be throwing the ball hopefully a lot more with Mike McCarthy here, kind of going to let Kellen Moore open up that playbook. So it was really exciting, even for me as someone who's a fan of the draft, but not necessarily personally a fan of the Cowboys, to see how they did it, because I think everyone felt that they just kept on knocking it out of the park, pick by pick by pick. And so maybe with this new coaching staff, it kind of freed them, the personnel side of the Cowboys up to kind of make these types of decisions that they thought was in the best interest of the team, and not just kind of a mix of what was in the best interest of the team and maybe what the coaching staff wanted, given the long relationship they had with Jason Garrett and his group.
Well, what's interesting to me is, and I am a fan of Will McClay, player personnel guy who has been with the Cowboys for several years now. Certainly, he's done a very good job with this draft, as well as you can, given the randomness of this exercise. At the same time, I look at it and go, sometimes the best thing you can do is not be too married to one guy in terms of what's going to happen. Rather, you take the best available, and sometimes things just fall into your lap. And so perhaps this is an exercise of not overthinking the process, taking best available, and you can have a fantastic draft because of that.
Yeah, it's definitely how I see it too. And, I think that he's been a calming influence on Jerry Jones, and especially in this draft. I think back to the Johnny Manziel draft when they took Zach Martin. I think that might have been one of the first years that McClay was involved with the decision-making in Dallas. And so I think he's had a calming influence. I think he definitely can't come away from this draft without thinking that he's a smart guy. But you're right. There's probably some element of luck to it involved for sure. Some teams can't control themselves when it comes to trading up. So the fact that the Cowboys just kind of stood pat and let some of these players fall to them, I think it spoke a lot to their kind of willingness to just, hey, let's stay this course. Let's trust our process. Let's not be rash. Like, for example, the Los Angeles Chargers traded up back into the first round, giving up their second and third round picks to the New England Patriots for the ability to draft Kenneth Murray, a linebacker from Oklahoma. So not only are they giving up a second round pick and a third round pick to draft a linebacker, a position that, is not really as valuable as some of the positions that the Cowboys targeted, they gave up limited resources to do that, to have that luxury, basically. And so the Cowboys, for the most part, let other teams take players who were not only, I think, lower rated in terms of expected draft position, they also let teams take those players at positions that are not as valuable in terms of winning in football. So to me, the most valuable pick for them in the draft, when I look at the kind of percentile of this surplus value for the players, and I think about which are the most important positions, that pick is Trevon Diggs, who was their second round pick 51. I had a kind of he was in the top 32 players for me when it comes to expected draft position. And so he was a 93rd percentile type of surplus value selection. And so, I think that they were even thinking with that second round pick of drafting Neville Gallimore, who had that kind of second round selection value, and they said, no, we have this guy we thought of as a first round pick. We want to put a star on his helmet. That's what Jerry said when he called him, right? And so you give up that opportunity. It's an opportunity cost. You say, hey, we like Neville Gallimore, but ultimately not only was Trevon Diggs kind of higher on their board, but he was also at a position of greater impact. And then to have Neville Gallimore still available in the third round, it just shows that they had the willingness to take a risk, because it's a risk. It's an opportunity. By drafting Trevon Diggs, you may not have the opportunity to draft a player like Neville Gallimore at a position that in mock drafts the Cowboys had targeted quite a bit, at least in the first round. And that's kind of where I look at to see teams' kind of broad pictures of need, because if it's a need that's kind of important, they might end up putting a first round mock in. And so, we had wide receiver that was a low kind of need, but when you get a player like CeeDee Lamb, it's really hard to pass. So to me, this Trevon Diggs selection was very telling. And you even heard, which is really interesting to me as someone who's interested in the draft and specifically using mock draft data, was, Jerry said, I think, that he felt that his analysts were saying that Trevon Diggs had a 1% chance of being available to them at pick 51. So they knew how valuable and how lucky they were in this respect to be able to draft a guy like Trevon Diggs, who was kind of an early second round, late first round type of talent at pick 51. And they made the right call in my view, and I think in the view of many others. And they did that process over and over and over again. So at every single one of their selections in this draft, you could look and for the most part say, hey, like they really felt the value was there. Or in the case of the pick of Tyler Biadasz, the center from Wisconsin, they did make a trade up, but it wasn't a huge trade up. I don't think it was a big negative kind of move for them to make a trade later on in the draft to ensure that a player at a position that they really wanted to target was going to be there for them, especially late in the draft. I think it's okay to make those kinds of moves, unless you're making a move like the New Orleans Saints did, where they traded away their kind of almost the rest of their draft to the Vikings. And so when we talk later on about which drafts I like a lot, I like the Vikings for some of that reason.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to get to sort of the winners and losers of this overall draft in just a bit. But I want to go back to CeeDee Lamb for just a second, because I want to borrow a concept from another sport here. And that concept is positionless basketball. And it really did innovate offense in the NBA when it was difficult for a defense to know exactly what this specific person was going to do, because they could be so versatile doing a number of different things. And it almost seems like that's what the Cowboys are expecting to do with this wide receiver core. Yeah, Gallup may be the one guy who doesn't play in the slot very much, if at all, but Amari Cooper can do it, and certainly CeeDee Lamb can do it as well. And I think one of the reasons why I felt like Justin Jefferson could be the guy for the Cowboys in the first round is because he was rated by drafttech.com, I believe, as the #1 slot receiver. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but maybe it's better to have a number of different guys playing the slot, including someone like CeeDee Lamb, so that defenses are required to prepare for even more things. And that's the whole point of football, right? Is to be unpredictable.
Definitely. We were talking about Justin Jefferson, and I thought that his value might be suppressed in this draft because he was solely kind of a slot receiver at LSU. It doesn't mean that he couldn't play outside, but they didn't do that for him.
Right.
And so CeeDee Lamb, when you see the versatility, he played in one of the more unique, Lincoln Riley is a genius. And so to me, like the fact that CeeDee Lamb, did as well as he did in the slot and as well as he did outside is a testament to the innovative mind of Lincoln Riley. And so, I think that Kellen Moore and Mike McCarthy, you read all about what Mike McCarthy did in this kind of off year, right? Where he met with some analytics people, he met with some other folks around the football community to kind of have like a sabbatical almost from football. And so I'm really excited to see the lessons that he takes from what you were talking about when it comes to this position with football. Like we shouldn't be wed to just say that, we're going to play Amari outside because we signed Amari for this big contract, or we're just going to put CeeDee Lamb in the slot just because of anything else. Like, let's move those players around. Let's put them together so that they have the best possible matchup. And so, I'm really excited. I think most Cowboys fans, should be excited because it feels like a beginning of kind of a new era in the coaching part and the strategy side of football. But then this draft also feels like it's a step in the right direction in terms of stepping away from a pick like they made last year, which was this kind of what I will call like a negative surplus value pick of Tristan Hill in the second round, where it felt like they were just drafting a player that they really liked, but without kind of thinking about value and if they could get that player later. So to me, it's very exciting. And if you can find ways to use Amari and CD that maximizes their effectiveness, that's definitely going to be huge for the Cowboys, kind of establishing some clear dominance in this NFC East.
Yeah, and two thoughts to that. Number one, I think it's one of the obvious reasons why the Cowboys took a step back in 2019 because they didn't have that first round pick, and it almost felt like they were sleepwalking through it and not necessarily gathering research to figure out who was best available. At least they learned that lesson for 2020, and they were able to capitalize big time. The other thing, too, there was a research project I saw at the New England Sports conference out at Harvard a few years ago, where the Cowboys were deemed as the most predictable offense among all 32 teams over the last several years. And basically that encapsulated the Jason Garrett era. And on the one hand, you understand that, okay, you have a dynamo running back and you pay them a lot of money and you have to use them. So that's part of the reality. But at the same time, you look at it and go, that's not how football works anymore. It's all about being unpredictable and then catching a defense sleeping. And then that's when you take advantage. So I look at this and go, to me, this does seem like a bit of a paradigm shift, grabbing someone like CeeDee Lamb. But even the second round pick as well, Trayvon Diggs, a cornerback was not necessarily a position of need, certainly not talked about as much as other positions in the defense. But at the same time, the idea of being positionless or having a guy do a number of different things or moving someone from one place to another, then maybe going back and forth, that to me is what it's all about, is having guys be versatile and then force your opponent to have to prepare for additional things.
Definitely. I mean, I think there was just news that came out today that they're going to ask Chidobe Awuzie to move to safety, which is kind of like,
right.
For the most part, if you're a cornerback and they don't think you're fast enough, they'll move you to safety. And so, I mean, the Cowboys have done this before when they drafted Awuzie and they also drafted Jordan Lewis from Michigan, where you kind of double dip at cornerback because you honestly can't really have enough good cornerbacks because the base defense in the NFL is not 4 down linemen, or for the Packers, it would be 3 down linemen, the 4 linebackers. We talked about that, but there's going to be a fair amount of nickel where they have 5 cornerbacks on the field, or 3 cornerbacks on the field and stuff like that. So you need to have those types of defensive backs. And Trayvon Diggs, he kind of, I think, he came on last year. He has obviously really great bloodlines. He's the younger brother of Stephon Diggs. He's very long and athletic. So he's the kind of guy who looks like a first-round cornerback that, for the most part, cornerbacks in this class were a little bit overvalued in the mock drafts. So you saw that, and you saw that the other position that was overvalued in the mock drafts especially was offensive tackle, but cornerbacks were up there too. So, glad that they could double dip at a position like that. And the other thing that I want to say about cornerbacks is that I was really excited when they selected Reggie Robinson, not just because he's a Robinson, but because I pretty much got his expected draft position like really right on. I had him 123rd and he went 123rd. So it's a double dip for me. A Robinson and then a exact hit on expected draft position. It doesn't get much better than that for me personally.
Kindred spirits. Who would have thought that the day 3 of the NFL draft would create kindred spirits? Glad you woke up early to catch that. One of the things I want to talk about, too, you mentioned impact positions. 3 impact positions when it comes to the draft. Wide receiver and cornerback, like you talked about, and obviously quarterback. That's sort of a given. To me, I kind of have safety as like 1B, not as valuable as cornerback, but also something to keep in mind, certainly bigger than the other positions. But it's interesting when we look at how the other teams in football really fared in this draft. And I want to get to your average draft surplus value chart in just a bit, but I specifically want to talk about Jalen Hurts, Oklahoma quarterback, formerly at Alabama, goes in the second round to the Philadelphia Eagles. And this is a team that, yes, Carson Wentz has not been healthy, but there's also reputationally something going in the Eagles' favor where they are willing to do more innovative things in a lot of different ways, to where it feels like Jalen Hurts will be more than just a backup quarterback. He may be used perhaps at the same time as Carson Wentz, or maybe in that sort of Taysom Hill sort of thing that the Saints do. What do you think about that pick in terms of how the Eagles fared overall in this draft? And does that change a little bit in terms of if you go with a backup quarterback in the second round, how much that sort of changed your calculus or thinking as far as your overall approach to evaluating a draft?
So yeah, I mean that's one thing that I'm hoping to eventually kind of add in is this positional valuation that you're talking about, because quarterback is so valuable. And I'm a little bit indifferent to this Jalen Hurts selection. I'm happy for him because I had him expected to go in the third round. There's something to be said that the Eagles felt that he wouldn't be available by the next time they picked, and maybe they didn't feel like trading up at that point. It's not a valuable thing to do to trade up in that third round for them. So I can understand the pick from a valuation perspective. I think that they had thought long and hard about this. I mean, the reports were saying that they spoke about this before the draft with Carson Wentz, saying that they wanted to invest a high pick at quarterback potentially so that they could have a better plan, basically, because last year, he didn't have a lot of help. So the goal was to get wide receiver help. And then they did that with Jalen Reagor, and then they drafted a second player, Johnny Hightower, out of Boise State later on in the draft. And then, with cornerback, they made that Darius Slay trade with the Lions in the offseason. So, I thought that cornerback would have been a good selection in the second round as well. But, to me, the Jalen Hurts pick is really interesting because he's definitely a more athletic quarterback, obviously. And, so he's not the classic Lincoln Riley drop back quarterback. His season this past year at Oklahoma, he was definitely a very efficient passer, but they also tried to take advantage of his rushing ability. So to me, it signals an interesting change for the Eagles. I still think the goal is to keep Carson Wentz as healthy as possible and kind of keep this Super Bowl window that they have open. But I think that they're also trying to make sure that they have an insurance policy if he gets hurt with someone who has kind of a more diverse skill set. So he's not just your average backup quarterback, like you say, where he's just handling the clipboard, where he also might be getting in some situations where it makes sense to have someone with a more rushing first kind of skill set. So, we know that quarterback rushing can be a very efficient way of moving the football, as we see with Lamar Jackson. I think the league, I was really intrigued by how this pick shook out, because I think it does show that there is some interest, at least in certain parts of the league, to take a chance on these athletically gifted quarterbacks and to take advantage of their mobility and their skills in the designed quarterback run game, not just in kind of scrambling situations. So it was interesting to see that some of the smarter teams in the league, and the Eagles are known as a pretty smart franchise. Not saying that there are other teams that aren't, but they kind of have a reputation for making a lot of evidence-based decisions. At the same time, if you believe that they might be kind of buying into too much of their narrative that they can take a backup quarterback and win with them, you take that Nick Foles experience as kind of an outlier. Hopefully they're not counting on that for this coming year, and hopefully, Jalen Hurts gets a chance to develop. He's not as great of a passer as Lamar Jackson. He's obviously also not as great a runner as Lamar Jackson, but he was really effective this year at Oklahoma, and I think put himself in a great position to be drafted where he was.
To borrow another concept, once again, you've heard of trickle-down economics. Well, to me, football functions with a dose of trickle-up economics, where, say, you have a player labeled as an athlete coming out of high school, and then they go to college, and then you don't exactly know what position they're going to be playing, maybe multiple positions. But it does seem like that the Eagles are approaching Jalen Hurts, where you're not labeling him as a quarterback, but just more ATH for athlete, and then you could do a number of different things with him. And again, reputationally, the Eagles and Doug Peterson certainly seem like they will be able to get creative with someone of his caliber. So no doubt that there's something interesting there that's worth exploring a little bit further. But when we look at your average draft surplus chart, you actually have the Cardinals atop the list, though they do have a bigger hole to climb out of competing for the top spot in the NFC. You mentioned the Saints did well, Eagles also high up. You also mentioned that you really liked how the Vikings approached this draft. Which teams impressed you the most, and did they impress you for perhaps different reasons?
So it's, people have asked me like which team won the draft, and I was talking to this a little bit before, that the draft is kind of played on a spreadsheet. It's not played on the game on the playing field. So we won't necessarily know exactly who won. We can say on kind of day one after the draft is over about who got the most value out of the draft. And so to me, that's an important exercise. I don't think it necessarily 100% correlates with winning on the field, because when you look at the draft surplus value, there are teams that are well regarded at the bottom of the list and teams that are well regarded on the top of the list when it comes to performance on the field. So one of the reasons I liked the Cardinals draft the most is just because so let's just take out the fact even that they made this amazing DeAndre Hopkins trade over the offseason and also got rid of a kind of cumbersome contract and situation with David Johnson.
Right.
So even putting that aside, which I think is also a really valuable piece to their draft, I don't think you can say that they drafted DeAndre Hopkins in the second round, but they did give up that pick in that part of the trade. But to be honest, for the most part, they also kind of played a similar philosophy that the Cowboys did, which is, for the most part, we have players that we like, and we're going to let them fall to us. And so in some cases, they got lucky. So Isaiah Simmons, the linebacker, the kind of positionless defensive player from Clemson, they picked at the 8th overall pick. I thought he was going to be maybe a top 5 pick in terms of expected draft position. So I view that as an incredible value for them. I think people were surprised that they took him first instead of an offensive tackle, which luckily they were able to circle back to, and they made the most valuable pick of the draft, which is probably one of the reasons why, on average, they do pretty well, is because my mock draft data viewed Josh Jones, the offensive tackle from Houston, as a kind of mid first round draft pick, and they were able to select him at the 73rd overall pick, which is an incredible value. So, and to be honest, people thought that they were going to take that kind of first tackle in the first round because they felt there was such a huge gap between the players that might be available after them. But then when you're looking in the third round at a guy that maybe had a first round type of grade, that's an incredible value situation for them, where they can bring in a guy that maybe they never thought they had a chance at getting just by sitting there and letting other teams kind of do the types of things that they wanted to do. And so it just happens that, just like with the Cowboys, the need and then also the value line up really well. And then just for the rest of the draft, they ended up selecting players just later than their expectation. And so, for example, the running back position this year was really interesting. I was talking about how the cornerback position tended to be overvalued in mock drafts. The running back position tended to be overvalued by a lot in mock drafts this year. And so what that meant was that the league valued running backs more than the kind of expectation in the public information. And so in that sense, you're able to get what I think of as like a 4th round talent in Eno Benjamin, the running back out of Arizona State, who I think is originally from Texas. They were able to get him in the 7th round. And to me, that's an incredible value if you can get a running back that kind of people thought of as a 4th round talent in the 7th round, albeit it's at a position of like low importance in terms of the number of the efficiency of the offense that contributes to scoring. But at the same time, that approach basically says, hey, we understand a little bit of kind of how this draft marketplace functions, and we can play around with it. So just like the Cowboys, I think that potentially the Cardinals and the Cowboys, as well as some of the other teams at the top of the draft, like Minnesota, have a good sense of what is being valued in the draft marketplace and can kind of work around it and pick accordingly and get a lot of value.
Just looking at the 2020 regular season schedule, obviously dates have not been announced yet because of the ongoing pandemic, but the Cardinals do face the Cowboys at AT&T Stadium. 49ers, Cleveland Browns, Steelers, also part of that mix. So there is an opportunity for the Cowboys to see how well these drafts played out right away. 49ers, not as good of a draft, but Cardinals, as you mentioned, Steelers did a couple of interesting things, and we talked about the Eagles already, and so certainly things won't be easy for the Cowboys given how well some of these other teams performed in terms of letting things fall into their laps.
Yeah, so I mean, some of the other teams you mentioned, I want to bring it up again that just because their draft was maybe not as positive in terms of surplus value doesn't mean that it's a bad draft. One of the most panned drafts in recent memory was like maybe the 2011 Seattle Seahawks. And so the Seahawks are once again at the bottom of my list of draft surplus ranking again, which is kind of where they like to live, basically. I mean, they drafted linebacker Jordan Brooks this year out of Texas Tech at pick 27 when I thought he'd be available at pick and somehow in the early 50s. So that's in the second round. But that class turned into, Richard Sherman. It turned into KJ Wright. Those are players that were the backbone of their defense in the Legion of Boom. And so, I try to be careful by saying, I think it's really apparent when teams win the draft, when you look at like the positions of value. But at the same time, teams can have this kind of heterodox type of style and potentially kind of capitalize on market inefficiencies that maybe they think are things that they value that maybe the rest of the league doesn't, and they can have an advantage in that. It's really hard to read. It takes a long time to see if that really figures out and how it plays on the field. But to me, I can see these top teams. I can see the Cowboys. I can see the Cardinals. I can see the Saints, and I can see those guys making kind of immediate contributions versus, players for the Seahawks. It's a little bit harder to see how those guys make an immediate contribution to them making a run at the Super Bowl. And so, when I look at the drafts for Arizona and for Dallas, I can see exactly how they're going to help, Kyler Murray with bringing in DeAndre Hopkins, with bringing in an offensive tackle to help shore up their offensive line because they've invested so much in receiver, bringing in Isaiah Simmons, another versatile piece on their defense. I see the same thing with the Cowboys, where you can kind of really readily see how those players are going to actually impact the performance on the field right away with high value players. So, it's a lot of fun to look at this draft and say, team X won or team Y lost. It's going to take a little while for that to shake itself out, but you have to feel good as a Cowboys fan with the kind of value you got. And maybe if you're a Seahawks fan, you're a little pessimistic, but to be honest, they kind of always do this. And so it shouldn't be a surprise to some that, when I was doing my mock draft for Football Outsiders, I had them taking Yetur Gross-Matos, defensive end from Penn State. And looking back on that, I should have known that was never going to happen. You just never know who that's going to be. And so,
Right.
It's always an interesting exercise trying to figure out who the Seahawks are going to be kind of selecting in the first round. And similarly with teams like the Falcons and the Patriots, and for me as well, the team that did, in my mind, one of the worst in terms of value this year, the Raiders, the Las Vegas Raiders.
So this one may be the most pressing question, which is why I saved it for last. Were aggregate mock drafts more useful and predictive this year with sort of the pandemic version of this draft, or were aggregate mock drafts less reliable because of a lack of data and information about players?
So I haven't done as deep a dive on this year versus the other years, but overall, I think that the mock drafts did pretty well. I think that for the most part, you can look at the league, and when I look at this average surplus value, or even in the total surplus value, it looked like most teams tended to take players earlier than their expectation. And so, it was really interesting. I was reading ESPN did kind of a similar exercise with their analytics group where they tried to kind of create this thing that they call EDP, which is the ESPN draft predictor versus my expected draft position. So, looking at that, there's a lot of ways to look at kind of what performance was like. And so this year, I still think that for the most part, it's relatively the same as what I would say. I think there's some positions where the distribution looked a little different than it had in the past. And Josh Hermsmeyer, the 538 writer, wrote that, the draft, he has kind of what he called the law of conservation of value in the draft, is that value in the draft really isn't lost or created. It's just redistributed in different ways. So for the most part, I think that this year mock drafts were about similar to what they were in the past in terms of predicting where players were going to go. In the first round this year, I didn't do as well in the first round, but I think I did a little bit better in some of the other rounds in terms of seeing where players were going. But the first round was really interesting because at the top of the first round, it was very chalky. And in the past, it hadn't maybe been that way as much. But in the rest of the draft, it was a little bit more predictable. This year, in the beginning of the draft, it was much more predictable. And at the end, it was a little bit less predictable of that first round, where I had a player like Josh Jones, who I thought was going to be going in the mid first round, ended up going in the early third. And so for the most part, a lot of the players that I thought might be late first round picks, a bunch of them ended up late second round picks instead of early second round picks. So that's mainly where I see the difference. And then when it comes to the last couple of days of the draft, or the last day of the draft, that's kind of as unpredictable as ever. Like, for example, I had the Atlanta Falcons drafting two players that I thought were undrafted. So it ends up being an interesting exercise in terms of what the distribution looks like this year versus in other years. To me, the first round was a little bit less predictable than it was in prior years at the bottom of it, but at the top, extremely predictable. I think that you just had to take a little bit of a different view of the draft this year because of what you were saying last week about the lack of public information. But yeah, for me, I think that it was mostly pretty similar, just redistributed in some different ways that made it a little bit more interesting.
And it's difficult to say exactly what you can point to as far as this draft being different than in past years. What caused that? Did teams at the top of this draft not want to diverge too much because of technology instead of being able to make phone calls at ease, things like that? Having everybody together in the same war room, maybe that did force teams at the top to be a little bit chalkier, but then as things got going, they were more comfortable. It's hard to exactly tell because perhaps even they don't even know what little inclinations or tendencies they had or didn't have in terms of how the pandemic caused things. And so perhaps it's difficult to exactly figure out what the causation is. At the same time, it certainly is fascinating, and I think the way you're describing, and certainly the way Hermsmeyer does, is terrific. Matter is neither created nor destroyed; it just gets redistributed, and that's certainly what happened here, where maybe there are certain parts of the draft you tend to do better at, but certainly overall the predictive value is there, just maybe in different spots this year.
Yeah, I definitely thought it was interesting that the league valued running backs much higher than the mock draft community. And so, to me, that was one of the more interesting ones. And then when I looked at the other side, offensive tackle, I think that people thought that, Josh Jones, who I mentioned before, and then Ezra Cleveland from Boise State were going to be much higher picks than they were. And so, it's really interesting how maybe a couple of guys can really influence that kind of that positional value because I had thought of them so highly. And then, Cleveland ends up in the second round with the Vikings. Jones ends up in the third round with the Cardinals. But at the same time, like you said, that conservation of value in the draft kind of just shifts the value around a little bit. So you may not necessarily see a lot of big changes. But yeah, I was really intrigued by the fact that the league valued running backs a lot higher and tackles a lot less this year.
Benjamin Robinson, thank you so much for your time again.
Yeah, appreciate it. And thanks for having me on. And maybe we'll do this again next year.
Absolutely. That'd be fun. Be a good time. Benjamin Robinson, data scientist, webmaster for grindingthemocks.com. You can follow him on Twitter at BENJ_Robinson. That's at BENJ_Robinson. And I'm Edward Egros. Thank you so much for staying with us. Take care, everyone.
Cowboys Deep Cuts is a production of Vocal. For more information and more programming, please visit vocalnow.com. That's VOKAL now.com.